Okay, we started. Okay. Good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Welcome to I think this is the last webinar, the last side session of the OECD conference for today. We'll just give people a few more minutes to log in and settle. We'll just give people till 3 minutes past to log in, and then we'll begin. I think we had over 100 people registered, so I'm just giving them a chance. It's been quite a long day with many side sessions. People might be taking, they seem to be back to back, so people are probably taking a break. Good to see John's here. Hi, John. Good to see you. What do you see your name? Okay, good. 1 more minute and then we'll begin. Okay, I think we'll begin. So welcome again, everybody. I'm Ashton Stewart-Cart and I'm CEO of TDI Sustainability. And today we're talking about FPIC. This session is the Human Rights Due Diligence and Free Prior Informed Consent. So free prior informed consent has become, increasingly relevant in mineral supply chains as the rights of indigenous peoples are becoming more firmly recognized in international and human rights law and practices. And as mineral exploration, mine expansion activities increasingly occur in locations that affect land and resources and the rights of indigenous peoples. And standards initiatives applicable to responsible mineral supply chains and due diligence, including finance, increasingly incorporate and recognize FPIC as a requirement of those organizations which apply their standards. So this session in particular is a discussion about FPIC, but in particular it's to announce the launch of a new verification tool for assurance frameworks for standards and certifiers of FPIC that will be coming out later this summer. So I should note here that this session is being recorded, so we can send it out to folk afterwards. But if you intend to make a comment today and having this recorded is something that you're not comfortable with, just please be pre-warned. So have we started recording? Yes, we've started recording. If you go to the next slide, Amy, please. So I have today with me, I have Sol Mills, who's CEO of Equitable Origin, EO, which is a standard-setting organization, certifier of natural gas projects, and an organization that for over a decade now has dedicated its mission-driven work to protect indigenous people's rights who are facing decisions about development in or near their land and the opportunities and threats that might bring. And EO has been developing this new tool that Sol will present after me, along with my organization, TDI. I also welcome Ben Chalmers from the Mining Association of Canada, and MAC, the Mining Association of Canada, has long been thinking about consulting on and developing ways to incorporate free, prior, and informed consent into its towards sustainable mining standard in Canada, but now in several other countries as well. And Ben will be talking about that. So I'll let them talk a little bit about and introduce themselves, and a little bit later and present their perspective on FPIC and how that's incorporated into standards. We were due to have another colleague from the EO board representing Indigenous peoples organization. Unfortunately, he was involved in accidents, so was unable to attend, but we'll persevere nonetheless. So before I hand over to Sol and Ben, I'll just try and set the scene a little bit. So free, prior, and informed consent, the concept of it has the ability to both inspire and confound. It's one of those concepts which feels very intuitive, but when it comes put into practice, it's more difficult than one first imagines. I actually first came across FPIC or similar concepts back in the 1990s when I was doing postdoctorate, and I was studying the power and participation between Indigenous groups in large infrastructure projects, mining and transmission lines. In those days, it was called consulta previa, and it's encoded in national law. So in some ways, it's not a brand new concept, especially when we look at the jurisprudence and how it is enshrined in international conventions. That example in Colombia was particularly interesting because we dealt with transmission lines. So this linear infrastructure of the transmission lines meant that the consultation wasn't a single event, but multiple, and had to follow across many kind of boundaries of traditional territories, as well as political territories as well. And we'll get into some of those kind of complications later in the session. But since that time, when I first encountered the concept of free, prior, and informed consent, expectations have risen very considerably. Definitions, interpretations have abounded. And it should be noted right up front that free, prior, and informed consent is now as relevant in Europe and USA and Australasia as it is in Africa and South America and Southeast Asia. So it's not a concept that is applied only to what we perceive as being developing countries. So back in 2018, EO and TDI, we completed a study with our partners in COICA and Indigenous Peoples Groups Coalition in the Amazon that include a year of consultations with Indigenous peoples there, trying to understand a baseline understanding of what is FPIC, specifically from the point of view of Indigenous peoples. And one of the findings we had there was that the Indigenous peoples themselves weren't fully aware of what is free, prior, informed consent. And the people who've been conceiving that at the national level have forgotten to inform them or even consult with them on that. So there is, the confusion around free, prior, informed consent isn't restricted only to those of us who are trying to understand it from the point of view of of Western Europe or North America, but even for the very subjects of free, prior, informed consent. So a little bit of what is FPIC, just to remind us all. In Sol's presentation, when she presents the tool that's been developed, you'll be able to look at some of the specific elements of what is free, what is prior, what is informed, and consent. But generally, it is most useful to understand this, I think, in the context of this conference at least, as a normative obligation, which is intended to safeguard Indigenous people's right to self-determination regarding their territories and their activities and their traditions and livelihoods and heritage and well-being. So what's really important to note here, I think, is, and to note why it's different from other processes which consult with communities, is that it is, or stakeholder engagement, and that it is a fundamental right. It is a right. It's a right encoded in international conventions and some nations' law books. So many consultation processes are cited as good practices or guidance, but FPIC is a recognized right. Another thing to note right off is that those rights, the fundamental right is the right to self-determination. And this means many things, but the context of the standards and assurance that we're talking about today means that it's not possible for an external body to deem that FPIC has been achieved. That wouldn't be self-determination, that would be external determination. So FPIC can't be done to Indigenous peoples or communities. They cannot be the subject, but they are the main actor. They have to play a leading role if this is truly free, prior, informed consent. Another point to note that while FPIC recognises the rights of Indigenous peoples to self-determination, it cannot be measured simply by affirming the right to say yes or no to development in their territories. The outcome alone isn't sufficient to be FPIC. It's also about the process, so the right, the determination, the outcome, but also the process. And the successful FPIC process, it can't be measured by the frequency of meetings with Indigenous peoples or between developers and government agencies, for example, or the volume of material exchanged or enumerated in any other way. Because really what we're trying to get at here is the creation of a space, a two-way dialogue that is carried out in good faith with equal participation from communities and from project developers. And also once consent has been obtained, i.e. for a particular action or a path forward, because I think we've also got to remember that the process is continuous. So it's not a beginning, middle, and end. It's this continuous dialogue that we're trying to attain. And that continuous process also incorporates other things that you might be familiar with, such as grievance mechanisms and remediation plans. And that's important because a part of FPIC, it's the right to make modifications to original plan that might have been conceived and agreed on. And again, so the emphasis here is on the continuous process and the ability to create that dialogue. So FPIC is not an event. It's not a defined beginning, middle, and end. It's the process as much as it is the right and the outcome. So that's a little bit about free, prior, informed consent, and Sol and Ben will talk about it from their perspective and how they've incorporated into their standards. But if you go to the next slide, please, Amy, what has then been the response of standard setting organizations towards FPIC? Well, I think fundamentally FPIC is a human right, and so it is invoked or implied in many of the guidance that we already have, including in the ones published by the OECD, the UNGTBs and so on. But more explicitly, if you go to the next slide, and in recent years, the voluntary standard setting organizations, such as some of the ones that you see here, have invoked the free, prior, informed consent, and they require that of the companies or the businesses that are applying their standard in order to get their certifications or the recognition that is embedded in those systems. Now, while progress has been made in better understanding free, prior, informed consent at development projects, and while there are quite a few processes which are continuing now underway to raise awareness about it and to share experiences and case studies of how it's been implemented on the ground, the study we did back in 2018 with the support of ISEAL, the certification organization, really recognized that the nature of FPIC, because it's not a standard practice and that it's not in the control of the company which is applying a standard, is a very difficult one to verify. So there's very little kind of tools, or no tools in fact, around how to systematically and reliably understand whether FPIC, the process and the right, is being applied across many projects. So this is really what the FPIC tool that EO and TDI have been developing, FPIC 360, that Sol will talk about now, is how do we enable the assurers to give comfort to the people who are using certifications and certification bodies as a way to understand whether their sourcing requirements have been met. How can verifiers really deliver a determination that FPIC process is actually happening. So that's a dilemma, and that's a problem that EA set out to solve. And I'll now hand over to Sol to introduce the progress so far on that tool and how it's going to be rolled out later this summer.
Thank you very much, Ashton, and thank you to everyone who's joining at the end of a long day of many sessions. So we appreciate your interest in this topic. And as Ashton mentioned, I'll talk a little bit about the tool as well as a brief introduction to Equitable Origin, and then our next steps in rolling out the tool and how you can get involved. Next slide, please. So Equitable Origin is a nonprofit standard setting organization. We were founded in Ecuador just over a decade ago. So we've been working with indigenous peoples in the Amazon region and now also in Mexico for over a decade. And our mission is to partner with business communities and government to support sustainable development of energy and natural resources. We use a number of tools for this, including a standard and a certification system. But we also, as Ashton mentioned, support advancing indigenous peoples' rights through partnerships with communities. We have an online Indigenous Rights and Resources Information Hub, and through this FPIC 360 tool. Next slide, please. So we started this process back in 2017 with support from the ICEAL Innovation Fund. ICEAL is an association of sustainability standards, and the Innovation Fund was set up to encourage innovation and collaboration among voluntary sustainability standards, and the fund is supported by the Swiss government. So with support from the fund and in partnership with one of the other ICEAL members, the Roundtable on Sustainable Biomaterials, and our Indigenous partner organization, COICA, the Coordinating Organization of Indigenous Peoples in the Amazon Basin, we set out to look at how FPIC is incorporated into voluntary standards and what challenges exist in implementation and verification. Next slide, please. And so we looked across the different international voluntary standards, including the international normative framework, to understand existing expectations of FPIC. And as Ashton mentioned, there's no shortage of FPIC requirements and voluntary standards. But our question was, how are these requirements actually verified on the ground? Next slide, please. And what we found is that the existing guidance and tools tended to focus on the outputs of FPIC rather than on the process or the conditions under which that process is carried out. Guidance tended to be very linear, and some of it was more of a checkbox approach. And the tools and guidance tended to be more focused on the company or the project developer rather than on the community. So as a result, we wanted something that could look at FPIC from all sides, hence the name FPIC 360. And so we drafted a monitoring framework for FPIC that includes indicators for assessing the principles, processes, and conditions for a successful FPIC process. Next slide, please. And over the course of 2018 to 2019, we tested this framework with Indigenous organizations. We conducted workshops in Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru with 15 different Indigenous groups to get their input on what they considered a successful FPIC process to look like. And as Ashton mentioned, sometimes there wasn't even a clear understanding about what FPIC is among Indigenous communities, although obviously collective decision-making is not something new for Indigenous communities, but in terms of how FPIC is framed in international law and in voluntary standards was something that Indigenous communities needed to become more familiar with. And therefore, we got input from them following a process of information sharing about FPIC and voluntary standards, and then sharing the draft indicators that we had to understand what were their needs and requirements in that process. And what we heard from them most frequently was that they considered the process to be as important as the outcome, and having the right conditions in place, having the right capacities in place, both not just from the community perspective, but also from the company's perspective, was important for them. And they wanted a way to be able to provide input into some of these monitoring and verification processes. Some voluntary standards, for example, require interviews with communities, which depends upon the independent assurer finding and seeking out those communities to be interviewed, rather than a proactive mechanism for communities to provide input into these processes. And then also, as Ashton mentioned, Indigenous peoples need to be the drivers of this process. They are the rights holders of FPIC. So it shouldn't be something that is imposed upon them, but something that is designed in collaboration with Indigenous communities, and to ensure that they can have full participation in those FPIC processes. So with that information, we took away those learnings from those workshops, and we adjusted the framework and developed the tool into a highly programmed Excel, which I'll show you a glimpse of later on. But really the goals of the tool, next slide please, are to be a way for different stakeholders, whether it's the Indigenous community or the project developer or maybe the financial institution, to understand how the FPIC process has taken place and to facilitate the ongoing monitoring of those processes. So it's a tool that doesn't necessarily need to be applied from start to finish. It can be applied at any time throughout the FPIC process, or even retroactively, as a way to evaluate an FPIC process that has already taken place. But the idea is that it's multi-sided, so it allows for community participation and input into that verification process. It's aligned with international human rights law and FPIC safeguards in many of the voluntary standards that we looked at, so that it can be used across different sectors, and that it can serve as a resource and sort of a roadmap for implementation of FPIC, both for communities and for companies. It can provide guidance for assurance providers or verifiers, assessors who go out into the field to try to determine whether a company has met its requirements to respect the right to FPIC. And it can facilitate gathering and organizing of verifiable evidence from multiple sources. What we found in talking to companies was that a lot of the FPIC processes happen at different times throughout different departments and different functions. So it can be difficult for companies to actually provide that verifiable evidence once they need to do that as part of a verification or certification or assessment process. But ultimately, we wanted to make it a user-friendly interface to be able to track progress of the FPIC process from both sides, the community and the company, and managing all of the supporting documentation around that process. And being a neutral third-party tool, we hope that it can also facilitate dialogue between the parties in the process. And not that an Excel tool necessarily met all of these criteria, but for now it's an interim step while we test out the indicators that we have developed. Next slide, please. So as part of this work, we established a kind of committee of interested stakeholders who may be potential users of the tool over the last 4 years. And this has really grown into a community of practice, which we invite others to join. And this will provide you more access to different iterations of the tool and assistance with implementing the tool. And these are the groups that we're currently working with in that regard. And many of these groups have also provided extensive input throughout the course of the development of the tool itself. So now let's take a look at the tool in a little more detail. Next slide, and the next one, please. So from a kind of bird's eye view, what the tool seeks to do is really look at FPIC holistically, not just the principles, which I think most of us are familiar with, the free, the prior, the informed, and the consent pieces, but also the process, what steps were taken to arrive at FPIC, and what the enabling conditions are, which are sort of prerequisites for a successful FPIC process to take place. And while these can vary and will vary from project to project and community to community, this tool can be adapted and modified to fit the local conditions. So for each of these components, the process steps, the principles, and the conditions, the tool provides guidance on good practices to meet these obligations, links to further information and resources, guidance on implementation, and examples of verifiable evidence and documentation. Next slide, please. So what that looks like in a bit more detail is these kind of 4 subsections of the tool. And on the left-hand side, you can see the enabling conditions for both the community and the project developer or the company. And these are the components that each party should have in place in order to undertake a successful FPIC process. So in the case of the project developer, this can help companies identify any gaps in their internal capacities to undertake FPIC. And then from there, you move into the process and the FPIC principles. And so here, the tool can serve as a diagnostic approach or an evaluation to understand if there are any gaps. And because the tool necessarily involves gathering evidence and information from the communities themselves, it can also help the project developer understand how successful that process has been in the eyes of the community. Next slide, please. So this is just a snapshot of the tool in its current form in Excel. It is programmed so you can fill it out, and the sheets are linked together so that you can actually upload or link to supporting documentation that is in the same file folder. And then with that information, we generate a report that can show where there might be opportunities for improvement or work still to do, work in progress towards completing the FPIC process. And the results of this can then be shared with the stakeholders involved and maybe assurance providers or even government agencies that need assurances around FPIC processes that are taking place. Next slide, please. But the longer term goal is to really put this Excel into a more user-friendly format that can allow for information sharing directly from communities into an online platform, and also allow for companies to use the tool and provide different people within their organization with access to link information into the tool in a more comprehensive way. So that's sort of our next phase after this current phase, phase 2, where we're hoping to test out the indicators that we have in the Excel. And then we're working with a software developer to put that tool online. Next slide, please. So in this current phase that we're in, our goal for this last year was to apply the tool in the field. Of course, we had to put that on hold due to COVID. But the idea is that as a next step, we will test out the indicators in the tool in an actual FPIC process. So this could be a project that has impacts or expects to have impacts on Indigenous peoples, whether that project is in the planning phase or is entering a new phase, or if an FPIC process has recently taken place. So what we require for this pilot is that the project stakeholders are willing to work together and that they're willing to test out the tool and share any outcomes and provide feedback to inform how we can improve the tool. So this is an open call for anyone who might see an opportunity to use this tool in the field. We're happy to get in touch about how we can support that. And then going forward, next slide, please. We are putting all of this information onto our new website, newly launched today, fpic360.org, where you'll be able to find information about the tool itself, a recording of this webinar, recording of other webinars we've done, find out about training for consultants or assessors that might be interested in using the tool. And then we can also support implementation of the tool directly or indirectly for any companies or communities that want to use it. It's an open source tool as it's funded by the ICL Alliance. So for ICL member standards and NGOs and communities, it will be available completely free of charge. And next slide, please. So again, if you're interested in learning more about the tool and either joining the community of practice or you have opportunities for piloting the tool, please don't hesitate to get in touch. And now I'll hand it over to Ben Chalmers to talk a little bit about how FPIC and Indigenous peoples' rights are enshrined in the Towards Sustainable Mining Principles.
Before we go to Ben, so hold on a minute, Ben. I've just got one quick question which come into the Q&A for Sol, and I think you have answered a part of it. This is from Camilla, who will have access to the FPIC tool, and you made it clear that this is going to go on fpic360.org and be available to all. How will this take place in context of low digital literacy or access to IT?
So for now, while we have the tool in Excel, the idea is that we would facilitate the information gathering directly from communities through our existing partnerships in the Amazon region and well, in Latin America in general. So we can gather that information directly through WhatsApp or other means. Eventually, we hope that the tool will be able to have a mechanism where communities can feed in information on an ongoing basis, either through WhatsApp or through some other mobile-enabled mechanism. But there will always be, even in that case, there will always be the field component where the assessor or assurance provider should be contacting directly Indigenous peoples to get their feedback on the process.
Great, thanks, Sol. And I think to help Ben in his presentation, I see if we can do a quick poll. This could go badly wrong, but this will help inform Ben's presentation. So you should be able to see on your screen now a poll. Can you see that poll? Somebody nod. Sol, can you see that?
I cannot, but I'm not sure if that's because I'm a panelist.
Not yet.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Don't worry. I'll come back to that poll a little bit later then, because that obviously didn't work. Actually, we go. Relaunch. There we go. How about that?
Yeah, that worked.
Yes.
Yeah, there you go. So now you've heard from Sol and me, and then we'll see what job Ben has to do. How well do you understand FPIC on a scale to 1 to 5, when 1 is not at all and 5 is really very well? And then maybe Ben doesn't have to talk at all. Okay, a few more. Yeah, it's actually pretty good. Okay, I think 77% of people have voted. That's 79. I'll wait till it gets to 85 and I'll end the poll. Okay, I'm going to end in now. Share results. Can you see that? So essentially, most people have a pretty high, I'd say a good understanding of FPIC, and that's all due to Sol's presentation. So now, Ben, really with that knowledge, it's around how you're going to present to us how Towards Sustainable Mining has incorporated FPIC into the standard, and perhaps address some of those questions which have been raised through Sol's presentation. Please go ahead.
Well, thanks very much, Ashton, and thanks for the opportunity to share the work that we've been doing in this area. There we go. So we've been at this for quite a while. We launched TSM in 2004, so we have 15-ish, 16-ish years of data at hand around how this standard has helped drive performance in our sector. It was the first mine site level, independently assured standard with multi-stakeholder oversight. Today, it covers a number of issues you can see on the screen in environmental, community, and climate change. In fact, we just recently finalized a new climate change protocol, which will replace the energy use and greenhouse gas protocol that you see on the screen. I don't want to spend a lot of time here. I think probably most of you have some familiarity with TSM, but I will be happy to connect offline with anyone that wants to explore more based on my presentation. But I want to spend most of the time talking about FPIC and our approach to it. Although I will note that TSM began as a Canadian standard, although in recent years it's growing internationally, having been adopted by mining associations in all of the countries that you see on the screen, with Australia, the Mineral Council of Australia being our most recent addition. And one of the notable things about TSM is that it gives opportunity to each of those national associations to work with a multi-stakeholder body in each of their countries to refine the process of how Indigenous people are engaged with. I mean, there's other areas that are refined as well, but one area specifically is that we point to around this national adaptation is to make sure that the context around national Indigenous rights and context are respected in TSM. For example, in the Canadian version of this standard that I'll talk about today, we worked very hard to make sure that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action were embedded. And I know our colleagues in Finland have made modifications to ensure that their version of this standard respects the context of the Sami people and so on. Again, just a little bit of background here to make sure you understand the context of how TSM addresses these issues. We rate performance on a 5-level scale, starting at level C, then going to B, A, AA, and AAA, where A is considered good practice, and AA and AAA are 2 levels of leadership. As I said, we began our work in 2004. 2006 was the first year of verified data collection. And so you can see on the screen here, there were 4 indicators in use in the recently replaced standard. At that time, it was called Aboriginal and Community Outreach. It's now been replaced with a new standard called Indigenous and Community Relationships, and it's this new version that I'll talk about. But the graph here shows in those 4 indicators that in 2006, only about 50 to 60% of our mines could meet or achieve that good practice level A standard. When we replaced this protocol in 2019, you can see that the results had increased pretty significantly, which is one of the drivers that caused us to create a new standard to replace it, to continue being a driver of performance. I think when you see that most of the members, most of the mine sites were at A or better, it ceases being a driver of performance until the bar is reset. So just maybe a little bit of context around how we work with our Indigenous people in Canada. It's been a long relationship. There's a number of highlights. We are the top private sector employer of Indigenous people in Canada. We have over 450 active impact benefit and other agreements in place, though we don't call that FPIC because many of these were done outside of a framework of FPIC. So they are just what they are, impact benefit agreements, or a number of agreements have different names to them. But we are very committed to working in this area, to driving performance, and that's why it's always formed a central pillar of TSM. So the new protocol has 5 indicators, and I'm going to talk about 2. I'm going to talk about 3 and 4. But just to give you an overview, the first indicator talks about how you identify communities of interest. And we talk about communities of interest because the common language of stakeholders doesn't respect the rights holder dynamic. So a number of years ago, we coined this phrase community of interest to be inclusive of stakeholders and rights holders. The second indicator talks about how engagement happens, and that is designed to be applied to communities, whether Indigenous or not. The third indicator specifically features those areas that are unique to Indigenous rights holders. And then the fourth speaks to community impact and benefit and how you work with communities around risk assessments from their perspective. And then the last is your grievance mechanism or your response mechanism. I'm going to focus specifically on indicators 3 and 4 here. And I've pulled out a few highlights, a couple of topical areas I wanted to address. There are other requirements in this protocol that I'm not drawing on. But I wanted to specifically start first with how we address FPIC. because, and this is, I mean, consistent with Amy's comment in the chat around how, our standard starts with at level A an obligation to acknowledge free, prior, and informed consent, that it exists, to build it into policy, to set out that it's this foundation that companies and mines are basing their engagement. But very consistent with some of what Ashton and Sol shared around how it's not our role as a standard setter, it's not our role as mines, as companies, to determine when FPIC has been granted. We have stayed away from making that determination as you move into implementation. So at level A, you acknowledge that FPIC exists, you set that as the basis for how you strive to work with your communities. And then as you move into AA and AAA, we really wanted to get into focusing on collaborative decision-making. So to us, that looks like the criteria that are on the screen here, where engagement processes are collaboratively developed with Indigenous communities, that you're defining how the facility will work with the community to seek agreement, how those traditional decision-making processes are incorporated. It could be that it's not appropriate for a new system to be created. The way that the Indigenous communities want to be engaged with is through their own established decision-making processes. So there's some flexibility there that's really driven in part by how the communities want to be engaged with. And then, of course, how do you effectively resolve disputes when they happen? Because this is, of course, an ongoing process that isn't defined at any one point in time. So as the relationship evolves, there has to be a way of sorting things out. And then as you get into the top level of performance, what is expected here is that you can actually show that those agreements are working, that you can show that agreements are being made, that decisions are being made jointly, and that there's a way of demonstrating how the terms of the agreement are being implemented and tracked through implementation. This is actually one of the things that I should point out about TSM here too is that it's primarily a standard for operating mines. So the very notion of prior is a challenging one to achieve this. That this is in part why we set out to create the framework that we did. Of course, at level A, we acknowledge the possibility of free, prior, and informed consent for new projects and major expansions. But when you're just maintaining an ongoing relationship, it's very difficult to build in that notion of prior. When we were consulting on this, we weren't sure about this process, this approach to it initially, until we started engaging with some of the Indigenous people on our community of interest panel and some others in the Canadian context who said, they very strongly agreed with us that it's not our place to define FPIC, that it was quite positive that we were laying the groundwork for, and the expectation that mines are making decisions with communities, but leaving it to the community to put the label on it as they see fit. Just a few other areas, just to round it out a bit. This particular indicator speaks to cultural heritage protection. Though this is an area that we're looking at, of course, in the context of Yukon Gorge. This protocol was finalized in late 2019, before Yukon Gorge took place. And so we're working on this with our Australian counterparts right now. We will expect, actually, I should note, I didn't say at the start of this that we finalized this in 2019, in late 2019. 2020 was an implementing year, and we will start to see companies report on their performance against this protocol this year. We talk about how to maximize opportunities for Indigenous participation through business opportunities, training, jobs, all of the typical things that are often associated with company Indigenous relationships, including revenue opportunities. And then there was a lot of work put into how we work with our own employees around training. And this was a central pillar of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada, that need to train your employees, not just on how to work with Indigenous communities, but all of the history associated with it and the cultural awareness. So there's multiple levels of training to make sure that our employees are well understanding of the dynamics around Indigenous culture, Indigenous history, and how to work with them. I don't have the level AAA on here, but at AAA, there's a requirement to get this out to all employees, not just designated employees. So it sort of builds from A to AAA. The other indicator I wanted to spend a few moments on, because I think it speaks to the notion of the informed part of FPIC, is our fourth indicator, which focuses on community impacts and benefit management. This indicator is not unique to Indigenous people and communities. This was applied to every community, but I think it's particularly important here. And what we sought to do with this indicator was to focus on recognizing that as an industry, we have not done a very good job of understanding community risk. We do a great job of understanding our own risk, of applying, risk management processes to our own business, but we have not done a great job of putting ourselves in the community's shoes. So at the heart of this indicator, minds are required to go sit with communities and conduct risk assessments from the community's perspective to understand the actual risks realized by communities and how they perceive risks, and then to work with them to prioritize those risks and begin to mitigate those. And then as you move into AAA, so again, this is a very collaborative process, just like our approach to decision-making in the Indigenous indicator. But ultimately at level AAA, you're looking at tracking the effectiveness of those implementation actions to mitigate the risks, and also looking at how effectively they've been implemented with the communities. That also works on the benefits side, that you're working with communities to understand the benefits that they want to achieve through their relationship with you and how to maximize those. So hopefully we've left a few minutes for questions here. I'm happy to talk more about the details of this. If you want to learn more about this, of course, my coordinates are on the screen here.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Ben. And thanks to all of you for submitting questions in the Q&A and chat. I'll try and group some of these and play them back to Sol and Ben. So maybe giving Ben a rest, you can start with this one, Sol. And there's sort of three questions that have been raised about this. And it's around, I think, the applicability to FPIC and the tool that has been developed around it, including Ben's standard, to groups which are not Indigenous, or how much does it depend, in one questioner asked, on the definition of Indigenous peoples in a particular country. And another one is, can this be applicable to populations that aren't Indigenous? And if there's a situation which occurs quite often, where you might have an Indigenous peoples group and a non-Indigenous peoples group, can this work, and is this applicable, and should it be applicable to those groups?
Thanks, Ashton, and thanks everyone for the tremendous amount of questions. So we developed this tool specifically with Indigenous peoples in mind. Of course, there is a trend to, among some standards, to require FPIC for all communities, not just Indigenous communities. And so the tool can certainly be adapted for that purpose. But for now, our focus has been on Indigenous peoples based on our partnerships, and also within the regulatory frameworks of the countries that we were initially conducting those workshops in, and looking to apply the tool in, where Indigenous people's rights are enshrined in the Constitution, and to some extent varying degrees of consulta previa are required by regulation. Of course, there's no global definition of Indigenous peoples. There are a certain number of criteria by which Indigenous peoples may self-identify. And in that case, the expectation under most standards is that the company should recognize Indigenous peoples that self-identify or meet those criteria, even if the government does not officially recognize them. And there are examples of companies that have done that and applied that definition independently of the government, or have even encouraged the government to recognize Indigenous peoples. In terms of, I think there was a question specifically around Afro-Colombians in the process. They were not part of the workshops that we did in Colombia with Indigenous peoples. However, Colombian law, especially around when it comes to mining, typically extends similar rights to Afro-Colombians as they do to indigenous peoples in terms of consulta previa. So to that extent, when looking at the regulatory context in that country and applying the tool in that country, they should certainly be considered.
Ben, how about your experience in Canada of that, and in your consultations and relationships with the Indigenous peoples groups to build out your standard? Is there a point that they might see the human right of free, prior, informed consent is one which is afforded to Indigenous peoples, and that way it should be kept for Indigenous peoples, or is it a concept or a right that should be broadcast?
I think generally the context so far in Canada has been to focus on Indigenous people. I would say, in Canada right now, we're going through a national legislative process to adopt legislation to enshrine the UN Declaration in national law. We've had one province, British Columbia, already do it. So I would say, not to speak on behalf of Indigenous people, because I would never do that, but I would suggest that the focus right now is on advancing those Indigenous rights. Though I would say, in agreeing with Saul, there's nothing that prevents the process that we've laid out from being applied in any community. The standard just requires it in Indigenous communities. Great.
So another one here is that, I think actually for both Sol and Ben, the tools that you developed, the standard and the FPIC 360, one has been developed in Canada mostly, and another one's been developed in the Amazon region, or with that as its reference point. Would you have concerns about applying it elsewhere, or do you think there's enough general or even generic elements that can be transferred?
I think for the FPIC 360 tool, we did develop it primarily with the Andes Amazon region in mind, and that's where we conducted our consultation with Indigenous peoples. But in thinking of the longer term use of the tool and in looking at applying it with international organizations such as USAID, there would need to be additional consultations in those regions in order to allow for Indigenous peoples to provide input on those indicators and determine whether those might need to be tailored or customized to the region. So we would definitely recommend that as part of the process of applying the tool to a completely different region. But hopefully with the methodology and the approach that we've taken to developing the tool, that approach could be replicated in other regions with other organizations.
And Ben, I believe that with TSM, where it's been sort of migrating to other countries, where those associations can adapt it for their circumstances, that?
Yeah, now it's important to note that they need to adapt it with civil society involved. The industry can't just adapt it on its own. Though I would say to your question, because the approach we've taken to FPIC is to very heavily emphasize decision-making process designed with the communities, I think it's broadly applicable. I think that part of the protocol could be applied pretty easily anywhere. There's nothing easy about obtaining that kind of agreement, but the concepts, I think, are pretty transferable. I talked about how the protocol can be, adapted to respect sort of national Indigenous context. There are other places in the protocol that's probably more apparent. Some of the language we use around training on cultural heritage and history and those kind of things may need to be adopted, and there might be other things that would be changed. But I'd say the FPIC part of it is probably pretty exportable.
Many of the standard systems that that are being applied now rely a lot on management systems, which itself relies a lot on documentation and evidence to do with paper-based, electronic-based documentation and signatures and so forth. Some Indigenous peoples groups might decide or have a culture of communicating in a different way. So how can we accommodate a non-written way of communicating when we are trying to verify a FPIC process?
That's a great question. Can I take a first step?
Great question or difficult question?
Well, both. I think the previous iteration of this standard was very management system focused. One of the things that we've been trying to do with TSM is move past that sort of checklist of, do you have the management systems that include this, that, and the other thing, to really trying to get at how effectively are they working. So when I had the requirements up on the screen earlier, one of the things that you might have noticed is that there is an emphasis on not only building the decision-making processes, but also working with those communities to design the ways in which you're going to track the commitments, the decisions, the actions, and also monitor how effective they are at being implemented. So it's not for us to say you shall monitor it for effectiveness in this way. It's really important, I think, in part for those reasons that you just gave, Ashton, around the cultural dynamics, whether it's more appropriate to do these things orally than written, whether there's an IT capacity or not, to the question earlier. It's really important that the community be involved in determining whether these things are working effectively or not. And then the verification process for TSM also requires the assurance providers to engage directly with communities. So it can't be just a paper-based exercise.
And so, Sol, this is kind of really at the heart of it, is like the verifiers, the assurers themselves, not just the mining companies or the developers, have to also engage and understand how the Indigenous peoples want to respond to these things. They can't just go in there with a checklist.
Precisely, and I think oftentimes, assurance providers may be evaluating a very broad standard that includes environmental, social, governance, human rights, Indigenous peoples components, and there may not be enough time or enough expertise within the assessment to be able to do a deep dive on FPIC and Indigenous rights, which is why we're hoping this tool can help supplement some of those processes that are more kind of sporadic, annual, short time on site. With the FPIC 360 tool, we're hoping it can become more of an ongoing mechanism to support assurance activities on the ground by collecting information throughout the course of the year and allowing for communities to proactively provide input on their experiences of the FPIC process, not relying on the assurance provider to come and find them, which is part of many assurance systems, but also enabling a more of a proactive way for communities to provide input into that process. And ultimately, one of the things that we've been striving to do with Equitable Origin and the implementation of our standard is to have Indigenous peoples be the assurance providers themselves, at least for some of those aspects that are directly of importance to them. And that's why we've tried to really embed Indigenous rights and Indigenous voices throughout not just the standard, but the assurance system, our governance structure, and a lot of the work that we do on the ground supporting communities directly.
Fantastic. There's so many questions, but maybe in the last 2 minutes, I can put one more to both of you, and really can combine into the ones in the Q&A and chat boxes. And it's really saying, what is the status? Are we really seeing an interest and uptick in interest from company developers themselves to figure out FPIC and how to implement it? And given that there is now currently, and here we are at this conference looking at responsible mineral supply chains, so much interest in cobalt, lithium, and other kind of battery materials inputs, what is the level of engagement that should be happening on FPIC right now? And I think that's really coming back to saying, among all the other issues that we're looking at, should FPIC be a priority?
I would say FPIC is a priority. Someone in a recent presentation I attended made the comment that FPIC is the ultimate form of human rights due diligence. If you have the if you've achieved that, if you have that kind of relationship, that mutual decision-making relationship with your communities, you're unlikely to have any of the other issues that often crop up because the relationship has achieved that level. So I think the time is right. I mean, I think the fact that, you know, our membership was able to coalesce around the standard that we did shows just how, you know, how mature, at least in Canada, the thinking is around how to work with communities. And I think, you know, as we've seen TSM grow internationally and you know, the other countries that we work with are well aware of this standard and are now, you know, moving to integrate it, speaks, I think, to the level of maturity that we're at least sort of willing to start embarking on this journey. I don't know, and I have no illusions that when we start reporting levels that we're going to be at AA's and AAA's, there'll be some, but I think we are sort of an acknowledgement of the need to move in this direction.
Sol, do you want the last word?
Well, I think given two key incidents that actually happened in Australia and in the US, the Dakota Access Pipeline and Juukan Gorge, which Ben alluded to, have really put Indigenous rights at the forefront of not just something that we have to worry about in emerging markets, but something that is actually important everywhere. There's an increasing movement in Canada to look at increasing Indigenous rights representation and Indigenous representation in ESG standards and their development. And then I'd also like to give a shout out to Kendall Salcito from Nomagaya, who published a couple of months ago a somewhat scathing assessment of IFC and how their investments are failing Indigenous peoples. So I do think it is an issue that is rising to importance, not just in mining, but in a number of different sectors.
Many thanks, Ben and Sol, and thanks everybody for attending. You can see in the Q&A on the chat box the different links. So that's fpic360.org and mining.ca for TSM. And please do be in contact with us and the panelists, and we hope to continue the conversation somewhere, sometime soon, and hopefully in person. And that I will close the meeting. Many thanks,
everyone.
Thank you.